Hello, welcome to AT&T ThreatTraq for May 6, 2014. This program provides network security highlights, discussion, and countermeasures for cyber threats. Today in Seat 1, we have Matt Kaiser. Matt's one of our incident response handlers and malware analysts and everything security. So how are you doing today, Matt?
All right.
And in Seat 2, we have Stan Nurilov, also one of our malware analysts extraordinaire. What have you been doing today, Stan?
Well, today I spent a very exciting afternoon reversing some malware.
All right, excellent. And I know you're one of our experts at that. Sometimes it's uncanny. You know, Stan, just as an FYI, can look at network protocols and automatically understand, oh, this is RSA encoding or various things. It always amazes me to the depth of his understanding of some of this stuff. And then also via video here we have Jim Clausing. Jim's also one of our premier malware analysts with AT&T, and he also does a lot of incident response handling and kind of keeps us up to date on a lot of the things going on out in the outside world as well. How are you doing today, Jim?
Not too bad. It looks like we're heavy with the malware analysts this week, aren't we?
Yes, we are. Well, I think we all kind of wear various hats, but I know that is one of the areas that we all kind of work in a lot. Today, I guess the first story out of the gate is one that you have, Jim. We kind of touched on it last week, the IE 0-day exploit. I guess there's some updates on that one?
Right. Last week when we taped a 0-day had been identified in Internet Explorer over the weekend, and we speculated on whether or not Microsoft would release an out-of-band patch for it, and in fact they did by the end of last week. To my surprise, I said last week that I thought this was probably the first big thing that would not get patched on XP, and it turns out they went ahead and they patched it on XP as well. I think mostly because that version of Internet Explorer was also available on Windows Server 2003 and so forth. So they did actually patch it on XP. So I was wrong. This wasn't the first one that went unpatched on XP.
Interesting. So it sounds like maybe Microsoft caved a little bit there in their policy, even though they've kind of stopped support for XP. This was a big enough one, and it was the first one since the end of life that they just went ahead and provided a patch for everybody anyway.
That's one possibility. Yeah, they certainly, as I said on last week's show, I thought this would be the first one that didn't get patched, and they went ahead and patched it. Of course, we knew that folks who had paid for extended support would get the patches for this one, but everybody running XP could have gotten the patches for this if they applied it.
Right. Well, that's a good thing.
Well, I tend to disagree.
Okay.
I was actually speaking with one of our other analysts today, and he does a little bit of work on the side, helping support other people's networks, and there are lots of people who are still hesitant to move on from XP.
Right.
And one of the things he'd been saying to them is, you're not going to get patches, you're not going to get security updates, you're going to be vulnerable for the rest of your life. And these people are coming back to him and saying, well, look, no, they're patching now. They're totally patching XP. And so that's more ammunition in their bag. Right. And it sort of lulls them into a false sense of security that they think just because this one's been patched, they really don't have to move on from XP, and that's not the case.
Right. Well, eventually they're going to get snagged by this, where Microsoft isn't going to provide a patch unless you buy the extra support contract. But I agree with you. XP is very old. People should be moving on. I understand it really was a good operating system, and a lot of people still like to use it because in some respects, what is the new versions of Windows providing for you so much above and beyond what you had with XP? But there is a lot in there, so I would recommend people just even performance improvements with the newer versions of Windows. All right, so the next story was another one that you have, Jim, another update on a story we covered earlier with the security camera DVRs that have been infected, the Internet of Insecure Things kind of story here.
Yeah, we've talked about it a lot over the last few weeks and months, and I had mentioned on the show before that my friend Johannes Ulrich at the Internet Storm Center has also been tracking this, and he's put up 2 new stories in the last week. One of them showing how the bad guys were actually uploading their malware on there. They've got Telnet open on these devices, but there's no FTP or wget or anything like that. So he figured out by setting up a honeypot how they were actually uploading the software, and that was kind of an interesting story. But the other one, and we mentioned it here, I don't think we've talked about it as much as Johannes has over at the Internet Storm Center. The bad guys, the criminals who are behind putting the coin mining software up on the DVRs, set up a Twitter account and contacted Johannes and took credit for it. So he's got a little story on that. The bad guys are still out there. They're still going after it. And Johannes has got some interesting stuff over there if you're really into the technical details of what's going on and how they're doing the compromises and all of this. So I highly recommend you go over and read the stories that Johannes has posted.
I think it's a little bold, maybe, of the malware authors or botnet operators to kind of reach out. Is that what was happening here? Was it the bad guys reaching out, or was it other? Was it the vendors? I might have mixed that up in my head.
On Twitter, it was actually the bad guys. They set up a new Twitter account. It was a brand new Twitter account, and they contacted Johannes and said, we're not the ones you saw in your initial report. We put the mining software up on the DVRs. At the Internet Storm Center, we've also had a little bit of contact with the vendors. I know we had speculated here on the show when the Karna botnet thing was going around about that, but at the Internet Storm Center, we have had some contact with them, and they are working on making sure that their customers know how to update and patch for the vulnerability. They've done a good job, actually, of responding to that finally. But in this case, it was the criminals that contacted Johannes. It was kind of amusing.
Yeah, interesting that they would reveal themselves, even if it is a new account and everything. But that's interesting findings. I didn't read the original story. You mentioned two of them there, but one of the things I noticed in my honeypot, and I don't know if it's the same thing, in terms of how they transfer the malware to the machine, they were, in the cases I had seen, they would use printf. So they, in the telnet session, where they do printf of binary, and they would just, greater than output file, and then a bunch of lines of that. Was it the same method that they were using here, or? Actually,
in this case, they were using Echo on the BusyBot, using the BusyBot Echo, or the BusyBox version of Echo. But that's essentially doing the same thing.
Right. All right, interesting. Good story. So I think the next one that we had was Stan. You were looking into some more pedestrian level hacking, maybe some things out in the real world that can be done.
Well, it looks like some researcher from IOActive, a company that does these things, he discovered that the traffic control systems that are in use in many places, they use magnetic sensors on the lane to detect what the congestion might be like. He found that some of that communication is susceptible to a few well-known types of attacks because the communication happens unencrypted and plain text. So this reminds me of many times proprietary type technologies being developed with proprietary protocols, communications protocols. And just because the manufacturer might think that nobody is looking or doesn't know how it works, that maybe through some sort of obscurity they'll gain protection, or maybe sometimes they don't even consider it at all. So they might not even consider that they need to secure this wireless protocol. So in this case, it appears that there's some theoretical potential for attacks that you see in these action movies. Kind of being able to stop cars at the intersection, or slow down the way the traffic flows so that maybe an ambulance can get through at the right time. Now, it looks like you'd still need to be in the vicinity of the intersection for some of these theoretical attacks. But I'm sure that if you look at some antenna designs, clever antenna designs, you could probably extend the range, and for an urban area, probably be able to hit a few different intersections to, if you were going to do some such attack. So it's a very interesting development. Again, reminds us of you got to think security throughout the whole development of your product, including something as seemingly unconventional as this.
So what are the components of the attack? I mean, what kind of effects can you have on the system?
It's just a sensor that basically detects that there's cars present or how many, and kind of relays that to another control mechanism. So what you're able to do, that communication works wirelessly. So you're able to probably, because it's unencrypted, you're probably able to spoof that, like the peering ID, say that there's more congestion on the road or that there is less congestion. And by using those kinds of tricks, you could probably fool the control system into thinking that the light should be red or the light should be green. The researcher here who reported on this, he couldn't obviously test those attacks because that would be illegal. And if he didn't have this system and it wasn't an authorized pen test, then that would certainly be illegal. So these are just some theoretical attacks that he described, but very possible, and we've seen that happen in the past with other types of devices that use wireless communications and don't have encryption.
So it's not so much...
And authentication including.
It's not so much attacking the central computer system behind it, but spoofing the signals to the sensors in the ground, if I understand you right?
Yes, that's what it looks like.
Okay.
Yeah, I think what happens, right, is, there's sensors embedded in the roadway, and when a car goes over it, the inductive loop kind of detects that there's a large metal object above it. And that goes to a device that is, in cities, the device itself is communicating with other devices, and they use kind of a variant of the Zigbee protocol from what I was looking at. I don't know if you're familiar with that. So I guess the crux of it is if you could inject yourself into the whole protocol scheme of them communicating with each other, you're not really talking to the devices in the ground, but more on the pole there that are communicating with each other. Okay. And so, maybe somebody crafty enough could make something that's just in their car. So when they pull up to the light, it seems like there's a lot more cars in the area behind them and makes the light change faster. You know what I mean?
It's a variation on that old attack. There's that system that ambulances would use, that strobing light,
right,
that'll allow you to get a green light because you're an actual legitimate emergency vehicle.
Right.
Some people were trying to build those devices a few years ago.
Right. Yeah, and I think some of that's still in play, from what I understand. So there's different ways for doing that traffic congestion or detecting when, cars are approaching intersections and whatnot. So interesting. Mm-hmm. I guess we'll see if anybody plays around with this more. Hopefully not. It's not something you should be messing around with. But obviously, the long and short of it is whoever the various manufacturers behind these systems should encrypt their protocols or have some strong encryption behind the communication to prevent this kind of attack.
To make sure that the sensors are who they say they are.
Yeah, yeah.
Authentication is key, and then the encryption, and the other thing we always say, don't be rolling your own encryption. It's too easy to do it poorly. Let the professionals do the encryption.
Yeah, good advice. Interesting story, because we don't normally talk about a lot of these types of stories that are more in the physical world. We talk a lot about things in the virtual world. This is an interesting physical world example of security. So, okay. So, and now, Matt, you've got some more virtual world type of security issues. These are the types of things we probably look at on a more regular basis. So there's something with Microsoft Azure that has been used for malicious purposes?
Yep. It's that same old story of a popular service being abused for malicious purposes. Mm-hmm. Microsoft Azure is offering a free trial of their cloud hosting service, which most people would absolutely love. Gets your feet wet with cloud. But phishers are using it for the exact same purpose. You can get a free 30-day trial, and unfortunately, some people are using certain subdomains of the Azure site. I believe it's AzureWebsites.net and CloudApp.net are the two that Netcraft, which is a website for watching like net analytics, has noticed are being heavily abused for phishing pages. The advantages of abusing Azure in this way are that you get a free SSL certificate. And we know most users have been trained, and for a while this was correct, that if you see the lock, you're secure. But these are all under the Azure domain itself. That's what the SSL cert is for.
Right.
So they're seeing a lock, but it's not necessarily for the site that they intend to be on. So if you can fool a user in the URL bar and by just showing them the lock, if you're a phisher, you're golden.
Right.
It seems that the SSL cert for that domain as well is not revocable, which is, it kind of goes against the idea of properly issuing certs. You should issue a cert in a way that it's quickly revocable, so that if anything does happen, you can automatically prevent any abuse of that certificate.
Right, and then people's browsers would start warning that this certificate's been revoked or whatever, right? But
exactly. So
for some reason it's not in this case for the, okay.
And who knows why. Also free email addresses, which I'm sure that phishers would love to be able to use. The one thing about it that is probably going to slow down attackers is that it requires you to register with a credit card and a phone number. Now, we know credit cards in the underground are easy to come by.
Right.
Phone numbers are a little bit more difficult. So this probably wouldn't be, like a low-level attacker. This would be someone who already has some resources, the ability to come up with a phone number and a credit card they can burn on this. Somewhere in the middle, somewhat organized.
Interesting. All right. So yeah, you need to have a physical phone that they're going to call and be able to receive that.
Although you might be able to do something with VoIP. Yeah, you were just thinking the same thing, weren't you?
Yeah, there might be some rogue methods there. So yeah, I guess so what they're doing is they're registering, so they can, the parent domain, azurewebsites.net, has the SSL certificate, and they're registering like rogue stuff, like, my legitimate company.azurewebsites.net
exactly
or whatever.
like
I see.
that.
Yeah,
Yep.
and it looks legitimate, right?
So as long as you can fool someone with
So do these websites get hosted in the Microsoft space?
yeah, they get hosted in the Azure cloud itself. Now, some of the sites are on the Azure Websites platform, which is sort of like a build your own website very quickly. There's the cloud app space, where if you're dropping in cloud instances. And it seems that the Azure Websites portion is being abused more heavily, because all you have to do is create a site. You don't have to create a whole cloud instance just to get your stuff there. So, obviously Microsoft is aware of the problem at this point, but, it's interesting to see that the same old cycle of free services being abused is still alive today.
All right, interesting. There was another story you were covering about some tricks with eBay and people trying to circumvent getting their sales through eBay and whatnot.
So this one is another one from Netcraft. They were really on a roll this week. Seems that some fraudsters are abusing the eBay website. It's an old scam. Sell something you don't have and try and do it outside of eBay, because eBay actually has pretty good fraud protection as long as all of the transactions and communications are done through them. So what the attackers are doing is they're creating on the classified ads portion of the eBay site, which it's really not completely done through eBay. You put the classified ad in, and then you sort of do your business outside of eBay for the most part, which makes it a little easier to pull off the scam. But what they're doing is they're actually putting in some JavaScript into the page itself. So you go check out, say, the car you want to buy from these people. And the JavaScript, once you load the real page, that snippet of JavaScript will redirect you to the attacker's site. The attacker's site will pull down the real page, and on the way back it gets modified. And instead of the real link for contact the seller, it injects an external email address. So if you were to click contact the seller in the real eBay site, it would go through eBay's process. You would contact them through there. There'd be a record of it. This cuts them out of the loop entirely, and you're emailing that person directly. And once you're emailing them directly, eBay has no idea what's being said.
Right.
And that's how the fraud becomes so much easier.
Right. Interesting. Yeah. So it looks like the whole real eBay ad, but they've just changed the contact method there. They've circumvented that. So now you're talking to probably a fraudster. Might even be a real ad.
From here, it says that the ads had injected code. I'm not clear if it was somebody else injected or the attackers themselves did it. But the interesting thing is that it's trivial if you're modifying a web page to make the link, because the text originally says contact the seller. And you know that you can just modify where that link points to. They're actually replacing it entirely with the email address as the text, which is a little bit sloppy in my opinion, and it should tip off users on the site if they're seeing it. If it doesn't say contact the seller, if it says some email address far off of eBay, you might want to look a little bit closer. You may not be actually dealing through eBay at that point.
Right. Interesting. Okay. So that's a cautionary tale for viewers. If you use eBay a lot, be wary of this tactic. And we have a couple examples up on the show here showing that it's got a rogue URL. It looks like a real eBay site, and then there's also it's a different contact the seller link here than what it should be. So, okay. So, moving right along, I think it's time for the Internet Weather Report. We have a couple of interesting things for this week. Instead of looking at some of the larger scale things, which we'll look at towards the end, I thought it might be interesting to look at some of the more discrete events. Not that they're discrete enough that they don't always show up in the top 10 list that we do, but they're probably important in that you want to keep an eye out for this kind of thing. So the first one is very recently, actually within the past day or so here. Looks like started May 4th and into the 5th and 6th probably. There's a lot of scanning on port 17988 TCP, which is not one that I generally know off the top of my head, but I went and looked it up. Sure enough, it's related to the HP Integrated Lights Out network card. And if you're not familiar with I'm sure we all are, but if you're not familiar with the ILO interface at home, this is kind of an interface that's in a lot of your Blade servers and other types of server hardware that allows you to administer the server with remote control, check the temperature, and do a lot of the external administration, not necessarily related to the operating system that's installed on there, but management of the hardware itself. So this is an interesting one because it also gives you, typically they give you remote control access, so you can kind of get a whole remote control session of the machine as well. And so what we're seeing is it's a very small number of sources, and I believe from what I saw, so I did look in our honeypot, I'll show you a picture of that as well, probably associated with a commercial scanning service. I'm not going to say who they are, but it looked like some of that was pointing back some of the scanning here. And when we take a look at the what we actually saw in the honeypot, so at the top here, there's a picture of what we actually received in the honeypot, one of our honeypots that we have. And it was a GET request for /XML data ?item equals all. And that didn't ring a bell either. But then I did some Googling around. I found a blog here for nachotech.com, and they had an article on how to find all the ILO cards on your network. And sure enough, I kind of highlighted it here. You can see that that's the exact pattern they go look for. And I guess if you hit ILO cards with this URL, they'll return back some information in XML form, giving you some identification information about the name of the device, maybe a serial number, that kind of stuff. So that's a method that they were showing. This is for legitimate purposes. Maybe you're just trying to identify on your corporate network where all your devices are in case you missed a few or whatever. Someone's doing this out there on the internet looking for any possible ones that are out there.
So it doesn't look like they're scanning for a particular vulnerability, just for the presence of that server?
Right.
Okay.
As far as I was able to determine, at least in our honeypot, because our honeypots are not responding as though they are an ILO card. So maybe if it did, they might go into some extra pattern. Although the people I saw doing this were legitimate, so I don't think they would, but certainly a rogue actor might be more interested to try to brute force their way in once they identify a real one there. So that's another good thing to be careful about. I think we talk about this all the time. Be very conscientious of what you're exposing directly to the internet. There's really no reason that I can ever think of that you would want your ILO network interface exposed to the internet directly. That's, like I said, the port for administration, kind of out-of-band administration of your hardware. And then there's another interface that would be like for the regular operating system to serve web services or whatever you happen to be running there for the operating system. So you'd want to be careful not to expose that, or certainly filter it to only those sources that need to access it.
Yeah, these cards should only be on some sort of an isolated maintenance network that your system admins and network admins are getting at, and nobody else should have access to those.
So the next one, and this is kind of a follow-up from last week, Brian, I think in last week's show, had done just a specific chart on port 8009 TCP, which is associated with the Apache Tomcat JServe protocol. I did a little more digging around in this, and we also saw some of activity in our honeypots. I've been checking these more lately because we've been looking at some of these scanning activity more and more recently. This chart here, it's a little busy. The dark green lines that we have here are the 8009 TCP scanning activity. You'll notice that they tend to coincide pretty well with other scanning activity, notably the light blue here, which is port 8080, which is also a extremely well-known port for Tomcat. And actually, I noticed that there are certain actors out there. There's a particular actor who came and scanned our entire honeypot on these 6 ports, port 7000, 8009, 8080, 8081, 8088, and 8180. which are all somewhat associated with Tomcat to some degree, and probably other services as well. And here's an example of what the honeypot saw here. Stripped out a lot of the information that we don't want to reveal, like IP addresses and whatnot. But you'll see it came in here on these 6 ports, 8009, 8080, 8081, blah, 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 which we've already mentioned. The interesting thing here, I think, is the resource that they're going after is /manager/HTML. That would give you like the Tomcat Manager interface if it was installed there. They're also specifying a basic authentication header in their request as well. This actually translates to its OG ==, which base64 decodes to just a colon. And normally the basic authentication is username, password. So they're just saying no username, no password, I guess. They're trying here to see if they'll get in. So again, we've talked about Tomcat before, as well as all the other ports that we talk about scanning, but Tomcat's one of those ones that worries me because I think there's some actors out there who are doing really bad stuff by compromising Tomcat. So just be wary of that and make sure that you've got those closed up and not accessible to everybody on the internet. And the last one that I have, well, the last one of our scanning activity is 1720 TCP. We picked up some activity recently here. This is really geographically dispersed. There's quite a few sources doing this, probably a few hundred or so, not thousands, but in the hundreds range. They're really dispersed, but the most aggressive ones are in the United States, the ones doing the heaviest scanning. 1720 TCP is the H.323 protocol, most infamously associated with NetMeeting, which is an older protocol, although NetMeeting might still be, or at least parts of that are probably integrated with other products. I know H.323 in general is part of VoIP, the VoIP standards now. So this protocol is for video conferencing, audio conferencing type of interactivity type stuff, and it's for the call setup part of it. So I would imagine whoever's doing this, they're looking for devices that they might be able to compromise or leverage to utilize for that purpose. What exactly beyond the obvious kinds of things, maybe toll fraud or call fraud type activities and whatnot. There could be other things that I'm not even thinking about that they might try to use it for. In the top 10 for the most probe ports, so this is the most ports scanned in general, not who's scanning by number of the people scanning or individual devices scanning, but just in sheer volume of scan activity. No big surprises here. There's not much of a change from last week, I don't think. You've got your interactive services like SSH on port 22, Telnet on port 23. Those are typically scanned for and then brute force attacked to try to get in. 445 TCP we see all the time. That's your configure infections, your other infections trying to leverage that exploit vector because that's a pretty well-known one. 80 TCP web, 1433 TCP, which is Microsoft SQL Server. You got your HTTPS, which we're going to take a closer look at. That actually shows up a little bit more in the next pie chart, more aggressively. 3389 is another remote access type tool. It's the remote desktop protocol. Port 8080 is mostly associated with Tomcat, although there are a lot of other alternative web services that do that. Even a lot of these routers, I think, sometimes offer their admin interface up on port 8080.
I was going to say, John, isn't 8080 also known as a proxy port in some cases?
And proxies as well, right. So that's another candidate that could be there. And as well as port 80, sometimes there are proxies that even listed on that as well. And then kind of rounding it out, the port 5000 TCP, this has gone down quite a bit from what we had seen maybe a month or two ago. And this gets back to Jim's earlier story of the DVR scanning botnet. We know that a lot of those Internet of Insecure Things, whether it was that particular group using those devices or another one using similar devices, we saw a lot of them scanning on port 5000 TCP, which is looking for this Synology disk manager software. We actually had captured some packets regarding that as well and confirmed that that's what they're looking for. And then what they do beyond that, I'm not quite sure if they were to find one, but there are various vulnerabilities on those devices, so that's probably what they're looking for there. In terms of the most sources probing, so the most unique number of devices probing, here 443 TCP is far and away the largest number. We're going to look at a more in-depth chart on this, but my guess, I don't know that we have a good idea exactly why, other than the Heartbleed stuff. from about a month, or I'm not even sure, maybe three weeks, maybe 4 weeks now. The Heartbleed vulnerability was discovered, and we're seeing a lot more sources in a coordinated way trying to scan for this port. So that's probably what's going on there, although maybe there's something else that we don't know about yet. 23 TCP telnet, no big surprises there. Just seeing if there's any other interesting ones here. The configure stuff is way down on the map. If you remember, probably a year ago, these ports were far and away the most, maybe near the top or in the top 5. Now they're starting to shift down. We're going to take a closer look at that as well. And then the other ones, ICMP, are probably somewhat innocuous, backscatter type things from scanning activities going on. 443 TCP, we talked about this last week, maybe even the week before. We started to notice, you look here on the left, and it's a very low number of scan SIPs scanning for this on a regular basis. But then we started to pick up large numbers of them on a regular basis here, probably starting around April 19th or so. There was a divot here. I'm not quite sure what that, what the cause of that decrease in the number of SIPs was for that one. But it seems to keep going up in little spurts off and on here. Not real exponentially or anything, but on a pretty steady state climb. The one thing I did notice, there are a large number of sources in Argentina, which we talked about last time. In terms of sheer volume of sources, most of them appear to be in Argentina, and they appear to be embedded devices. Again, your Internet of Insecure Things. So somebody's doing something with those. I'm not quite sure what yet, but there's a large number of those in that area. They're not scanning really aggressively, those ones. In terms of the most aggressive scanners, in terms of the volume of scanning on this port, it's mostly coming from China, but there's far fewer of them in number, maybe tens of them as opposed to hundreds of them in Argentina. And then there's a bunch of other scattered sources. Like I said, it is pretty geographically dispersed, what's going on here. It's probably some kind of botnet activity just because of the way this is climbing up this, in such uniform fashion. But we're seeing other sources in US, Taiwan, Netherlands, Italy, Germany, and probably a few other countries as well. So ZeroAccess, I only did a 365-day chart because trying to get a 2-year chart actually takes a little longer, and I didn't get a chance to do that this morning. However, you can kind of see here that, it was on a decline. It resurged somewhere late last year in the October-November timeframe of 2013. And it's been steadily going down. There were some takedown activities. Microsoft had done a takedown activity. Someone else did as well. I want to say Symantec, but I can't remember if that's accurate or not. And it's been steadily declining here to the point that, they're not showing up on our top 10 chart as much as they had before. Certainly 2 of them are. It's probably the blue one and the green one, I would guess. But I have to go back and look at our chart. But in any event, it seems to be declining, so that's a good thing. This is a botnet infamously associated with click fraud activities. I think did they have some Bitcoin mining too? I think they might have with ZeroAccess. And that's our show for today. If you'd like to get in touch with us, you can email us at threattrack@list.att.com. You can also follow us on Twitter. And to get notice of new episodes and whatnot, our handle there is @ThreatTraq. The ThreatTraq video is also available on att.com/ThreatTraq and on the AT&T Tech channel on YouTube. So on YouTube we have our own AT&T Tech channel there. There's also an audio-only version on iTunes. Thanks for joining us today. Thank you, Jim, Matt, and Stan for joining me as well. We'll be back next week with a new episode. Until then, keep your network safe.